everyone, and welcome to Global 360, the brand new webcast produced by the Washington Diplomat, which, as some of you may know, has been the flagship publication of the diplomatic community in DC for the last 25 years. And now, in that time, in addition to the newspaper, we have offered the community a variety of things, including events such as ambassador discussions, an online newsletter, and now a webcast as we expand our digital footprint. So my name is Anna Gawel. I am the managing editor of The Diplomat and your co-host. And I want to introduce my fellow co-host and esteemed journalist, Eric. Say hello. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Hello, everyone. It's so good to be here doing our inaugural webcast. It's great to be talking about all of these issues. I am Eric Ham. I'm a contributor with the Washington Diplomat. In addition to that, I host at SiriusXM Radio's The POTUS channel and also serve as an analyst for the BBC.
Okay. So Eric is our political guru. I've written more on the international side, U.S. foreign policy, but world affairs, and quite a number of articles over the years. And not to date myself here, but a lot of people don't know, my first day on the job at The Diplomat was actually 9/11. I was pulling into the parking lot, sadly, when the first plane hit the Twin Towers. And, you know, obviously that was a chaotic day for the news business, for the country, for the city, for the world, for everybody. But, you know, we managed to, I think, get through it and show a lot of solidarity. And I am genuinely optimistic that we can do the same thing with this current crisis of coronavirus. And while they're certainly not the same things, I do see a lot of parallels in that when you think of 9/11, it fundamentally altered our lives. I mean, we don't even think twice about taking our shoes off at the airport anymore. And in a similar fashion, I think the pandemic will alter our lives, and we're seeing it right now. I mean, we're online right now, and we've always been taking the virtual leap, but now it's going to be an enormous jump. And it's changing our jobs. And similarly, of course, it's changing the jobs in the face of diplomacy and governing in general. And I think it brings up, that'll be the topic of our show, it brings up an interesting debate. You know, ambassadors, of course, are also working remotely, teleworking, just like everyone else. Primarily from what I've heard, their main job has been, especially when the pandemic broke out, to kind of make sure their foreign nationals can return back home. They've certainly had an added social media presence. There are certain ambassadors, certain embassies that are much more active on social media than others. And I suspect that will have a big boost overall. But, you know, from the ambassadors and diplomats that I've talked to, there is this concern where on the one hand, being able to work virtually, I mean, has saved almost all of us. I mean, it's become an integral part of how we function during this pandemic. But there is a concern that you will lose a certain element of face-to-face diplomacy. And as anybody knows who's been in the DC scene, there's a social circuit. You go to a lot of receptions. I know, Eric, you know, and, you know, beyond there is some food free, you know, wine and food might be a bit of a perk, but the schmoozing does serve a purpose. I mean, when you make a face-to-face, person-to-person connection, that's really how a lot of things get done. It's how we get half of our story ideas. And, you know, I've heard ambassadors say that there's a concern where if you're in the midst of getting to know somebody or a negotiation, you can kind of hide behind a computer in a way that you can't face-to-face. And, you know, there's so many things that you do pick up. Social cues, you can kind of force more of a compromise when you're looking a person. And then there's a lot of practical limitations. There's access to technology, which not all countries have. There are huge security issues. I was reading that Taiwan recently has banned Zoom because of its connection to China. And so Eric will be able to talk about this more, but there are so many parallels to US Congress and facing the same dilemmas, security issues, practical issues. There are hiccups. You know, Congress is not all spring chickens when it comes to adapting to technology, and neither are we. And obviously the constitutional issues, but, you know, Eric, you've been in the meat grinder. There's something to be said about, committee members hashing out an appropriations bill in the middle of the night and being able to go one-on-one and huddle that you just can't have with this format. So anyway, what are some of your thoughts being in the political realm?
Yeah, the first thing, thanks, Anna. The first thing that comes to mind is the cloakroom. And there's no digital cloakroom, no virtual cloakroom for members of Congress or even for diplomats. And the cloakroom is typically a room that's off of the floor of the chamber where members are debating legislation, things like that. And there's a room that's off of the main floor where members will gather and they will actually hash out key sticking points that may be stopping legislation from getting through. And so now that you've got members dispersed through their 535 districts, the question is, how do they now maintain that level of camaraderie? How do they maintain that ability to get over some of these hurdles? For example, now there's a sticking point on an additional phase of stimulus spending. And now that members are not here, how are they actually going to be able to address that issue? And I'm sure those are some of the hurdles that we're also seeing with the diplomatic community as well. Because again, everything was face-to-face and being able to press the flesh. But now it seems as though with this pandemic, everyone has gone dark. And you're right, there are those who perhaps have a much larger digital footprint than others. And so during this time, perhaps that's one area where people can now begin to address, becoming more digitally savvy. But until people get to that point, if in fact they do get there, where does that leave the United States? Where does that leave us both domestically and internationally? And also for the diplomatic community to be able to continue to engage with one another, especially now that we're seeing not only how COVID-19 is impacting the United States, but we cannot just dismiss the fact that we are in the middle of an election year. And now it appears as though politics are really beginning to rear themselves in the midst of COVID-19. And now that you have diplomats who cannot really be engaged on the pulse of what's happening politically, that certainly will take away from, I think, much of the heft, particularly when they're drafting cables, when diplomats are drafting their cables to send back to their respective countries. Because one of the things that we've seen from diplomats is their ability to engage, to go to places like Iowa or New Hampshire. But I doubt very seriously there were many diplomats in Wisconsin during the latest Democratic primary that took place. And so now we're seeing not only are the diplomats losing that, but also many of us are losing that because we're now entering into this great unknown and we just don't know how it all will play out.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned the cloakroom. I remember there was a staffer who he didn't say cloakroom, but he said, there's something about being in person where you can corner the other person during, all night negotiations. Are you sure you don't want to budge on this? And I mean, as much as people think, there's political gridlock, things get done much more in person. And I mean, there's a lot of parallels with the EU as well. You have language translation issues of, you can have a translator in the room, whereas are you going to have 8 translators for, 18, whatever, 28, 27 EU countries? So there are so many kind of practical logistics. And, as you mentioned with the US elections, it's difficult now for diplomats to, they did travel to Iowa, they did travel to New Hampshire, all of that has stopped. And it's incredibly difficult for the candidates. I mean, you have, and I know, you'll talk more about this, but Joe Biden is I heard one place refer to him as analog Joe. I mean, he's, and I relate. I feel sometimes like a tech dinosaur, but this is upending how people will campaign, how people will vote. And beyond the US, we're already seeing, we're waiting until November, but we've already been seeing it. People have been citing South Korea as this model for us. And that's a little tricky to emulate because, South Korea from day one, they kind of acted. They definitely acted much quicker than we did, than the US government did. They've done absolutely aggressive testing, as you know, aggressive tracing, We have not. We don't know if we're going to have those kind of capabilities. So they were able to pull off an election successfully, which really rewarded the party in power because of the way that they've handled coronavirus. But we so far have not shown that we're capable of doing what South Korea has done now, let alone in November. I think a good analogy is actually Poland, which a lot of people haven't paid as much attention to as South Korea. They are forging ahead with their elections in May, and that's been very controversial because the ruling party, Law and Justice Party, ironically has been criticized for stifling the judiciary and the media. And the concern of the opposition is that they have an automatic platform. The president in power can go to a hospital and talk about coronavirus. And whereas the opposition can't exactly hold a 500-person rally. And there's a lot of parallels here where Trump has the bully pulpit, so to speak, of the press conferences. Whether you love them or hate them, they attract a lot of attention. And Biden does not have that advantage. And so, I mean, going forward, this is going to be, I almost think, one of the main issues of how do you adjust to campaigning in the US?
I think particularly when we're thinking about the diplomatic community, and now that we've got an entire country that's on shutdown, many of the states are on shutdown, 3 out of 4 Americans are facing a stay-at-home order. And I think what we're seeing is just how fragile the country is, not only as it relates to how we handle something like a pandemic, but also what that means for our ability to vote, which is sacrosanct living in a democracy. And I think this is a moment, this is a time where I think all of these diplomats are sitting around and really watching, because I'm sure many countries watch the United States and hold the United States up as a model in terms of voting. And we saw how the Supreme Court recently came down on a decision on mail-in voting. And I think that's going to be an issue that's really going to play out. So it's not just the fragility that the United States is facing as it confronts this virus, but also what does that mean for democracy? What does it mean for this lone superpower that is also this beacon for democracy, and how all of that is going to play out in November? Just recently, we know that Senator Kamala Harris, who also was a Democratic candidate for president, and who many believe could be Joe Biden's vice presidential running mate, she just recently introduced legislation that would actually increase the ability to vote by mail. And so I think how lawmakers actually navigate this process will be eye-opening for the diplomatic community. And even though they too cannot really be on the ground to get a sense, to get a pulse of what's exactly happening, I think how the United States moves through and how the United States actually handles voting in 2020 in the midst of a pandemic will be a telltale sign for many in the diplomatic corps, particularly as it relates to the United States and basically the health of US democracy.
Yeah. And as if the election was not dramatic or complicated enough to begin with. I have to admit, sometimes being a journalist and just commenting on it versus trying to completely figure it out and explain it to a home government, I have to give diplomats their due for that's a tough job. That's a tough job on a normal election year. But no, I mean, Eric, that's exactly the point. I mean, you have so many countries, I think South Korea is so far the anomaly. You have countries that have canceled elections for good reason, like Ethiopia. I mean, you just, you can't take that risk of that many people. But you have other countries like Bolivia that were already in the midst of what some called a coup against the president, Evo Morales. And the interim leader said she wasn't going to run. Now she is going to run. Now they've canceled elections. You've really muddied the waters in terms of, what a government might do. And like you said, we are really in the months ahead going to be such a model. And on top of that, we don't know what will happen with the pandemic in the months ahead. I mean, there's so much uncertainty, as you said. And so it's going to keep us busy.
But also we cannot discount the fact that prior to the pandemic, you know, many of us who are watching the election, who are watching what's taking place, were looking at a president who had been impeached and wondering what impact that would have on
How
this
quickly
election.
we've forgotten that.
Exactly. But not just the impeachment, but of course, we do know that there were a number of lawmakers that were pushing legislation, pushing for appropriations to fund the election to ensure that there was no interference in the election. So just because the United States is in the midst of a pandemic right now that will certainly impact the election, these other issues have not gone away. So what we have done is we have placed layers on top of layers that has just really changed all of this, and it certainly has taken the country in many different directions. And I've got to believe that some of these diplomats are looking at this with whiplash, because 1 minute it was, is Russia going to stay involved? Is Russia going to impact the elections? And then President Donald Trump was impeached, the first president in U.S. history to be impeached in his first term. And then the question is, how is that going to impact the elections? And now on top of all of that, you've got a global pandemic. The United States is leading the world, both in confirmed cases and deaths. By August, when the Republican National Committee will hold their convention to renominate Donald Trump to president of the United States, the country is expected to see more than 60,000 deaths from this virus. And
depending on the model. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that all will shape the election going forward. But of course, will there even be a convention to actually nominate the president again? So these are just issues that I've got to think that the diplomatic community are looking at this and thinking this has got to be the ultimate test case, the ultimate democracy, versus the ultimate calamity, plural, of what's actually taking place and how all of this will play out. And for those of us who live watching this, even we have no clue what's
I was going to say my neck hurts a bit from the whiplash. And I mean, that's great of what you said too, because it almost comes for full circle in a sense. I mean, for instance, we had a large article on election interference from Russia, efforts for the states to secure their voting machines, and the conflict between states and the federal government, the GOP, delegating less money for state security. That has changed. It was an ongoing debate that wasn't getting a lot of attention, and we wrote about it. It, in a sense, comes back full circle, because you get to Zoom. You get to, okay, what if you have Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell talking like this through Zoom, but Russia hacks it. I mean, all of these problems, like you said, it's not one new problem, it's layer upon layer upon layer. So I think we're gonna have a lot to talk about.
I think that's the understatement of the year.
I'm being diplomatic.
Oh, sure. I mean, because we've got a president who every day when he stands at that podium to deliver his address on the COVID-19 crisis, he's always talking about how, and he's always saying that the United States now has more ventilators, more of this, more of that we're sending to other countries. And again, and we're seeing a president who seems to be changing, at least in terms of his thinking globally, because this is a man who has always sought to remove the United States from the international community. And now he's saying, we want to be the pillar of goodwill, ensuring that other nations have exactly what they need in the midst of the crisis, even though many of his own citizens are grappling with this and don't have what they need. And many frontline workers simply don't have it as well. But it's a very interesting test case that we do now have a president who for 3 years has
America first.
Railed, right? Yeah. America first has railed against a multilateral approach to governing. And now that he's in the twilight of his term, his first term, now it appears as though he's looking to the rest of the world.
Right. And not just railed against kind of these multilateral institutions, but government itself. Whereas now, I mean, there's polls that show that Americans have more trust in the CDC and NIH and so forth, which those would not have been the same polls as a year ago. And
Right.
I mean, this gets to so many complex dynamics. And then, just as you said, you have the president one moment wanting to reach out and saying, we're all in this together. And then you have China and the president's dynamic with that, which that's a whole second round of whiplash that people aren't prepared for. And then, you know, just the news of cutting funding for WHO. And that is something that's something we're going to explore in our next webcast, because we could be here for a number of hours, but, and I'm sure, you know, who knows, we like to talk, but maybe one day we will be, but definitely this gets into this much fundamental, larger issue of this US-China kind of coronavirus battle for the hearts and minds of the world, and President Trump on the one hand doing what a lot of leaders are doing, which is you want to protect your own population, but you know, if your neighbor's house is burning down, none of that matters. And it's this tug of war of globalization, and we're really seeing that a lot between US and China. So I think we're going to focus on that the next time around. The other thing we are going to do with our webcasts is a cultural corner at the end, which is much more local. As you know, for us at the Diplomat, we do cover international affairs, but we're also very on top of what's happening in the local diplomatic community in DC. And a huge part of that is cultural. There's a lot of arts and culture, international happenings all around town. We have a very popular monthly events and film calendars that is probably the most exhaustive in town of international events. And I'm not just saying that because I write it every month. You know, it's not a humble brag at all, but it is. It's the best. But what I'm going to do, obviously, unfortunately, people cannot go out to the embassies and their cultural centers, but we will continue to highlight, and I have my list here. I'll go through real briefly. Basically, you know, a lot of museums in DC are going virtual, and embassies are also kind of getting on the bandwagon with this. And so each webcast, I'm going to kind of highlight a few embassy events and international events that you can enjoy from home. And for more information, you can go to our Facebook page. Just type in the Washington Diplomat. You can also go to our website, watchdiplomat.com. And since there, we're going to have all the links and all the fun details of everything. But just real quickly, a lot of people, because as you know, Eric, things have gotten buried in the news, but it's actually been 1 year since that disastrous fire almost destroyed Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris.
Oh, okay.
So that anniversary kind of came and went. And obviously, it's still a huge rebuilding project. So the French embassy, they have a website called frenchculture.org. And they're offering visitors this like really cool virtual reality tour of the cathedral before and after and the rebuilding process. Wow. So that's kind of a nice thing to, well, not nice, but when they rebuild it, it'll be nice to kind of step away. And they also have a lot of other recommendations on things such as concerts from French radio, virtual visits to poetry readings happening in French-speaking countries in the Caribbean, for instance. So it's a really nice thing to do from home. There's also, similarly, there's something called Spain Arts and Culture, which is the cultural arm of the Spanish embassy. And they too have a lot of different things, including they're going to have an upcoming book day where they'll have famous Spanish authors reading from contemporary and classical Spanish literature. And they also even have a very interesting cultural section. We have a lot of information. I'll post it on our website so that when our lockdown does lift, knock on wood, it's a beautiful cultural center on 16th Street, and it's absolutely worth a visit. And we will have all of that. And they're also actually doing a hashtag museum from home with a bunch of other museums where you can look at exhibitions. And House of Sweden also is one of the more stunning embassies. House of Sweden, it literally just means Swedish embassy. But it sounds very fancy. But it is an amazing house. It's a cool name. it's this stunning contemporary glass enclosed embassy that overlooks in Georgetown, the Potomac River. So they do these really interesting thematic year-long programs, and we're going to have a story on it. It's about smart mobility, basically how transportation has completely changed our lives. And we'll have the story on it. Unfortunately, you can't attend, but it's for all year. So again, optimism will reign, and hopefully you can check out the exhibition once everything opens up. But in the meantime, they actually also have their own hashtag, which is something #Sweden. I don't have it right here, but I'll have it on our Facebook page. But same thing, they will be live streaming royal concert operas. They will be doing intimate jam sessions with Swedish musicians. So there's a lot of live streaming options, and I will have that all up on our Facebook site. And the final thing I wanted to point out, we have an article written in our April issue. There is an exhibit by a Mexican artist called Graciela Iturbide. Sure, I butchered the name, but it's at the National Museum of Women in the Arts, and it is being offered completely virtually online, and it's an absolutely stunning exhibition. It really offers outsiders a nice inside look into kind of the real Mexico. And again, not humble bragging that I co-wrote the article at all. It's not, not a shameless plug whatsoever. But my last shameless plug is, if you would like to, we have an online newsletter called the Diplomatic Pouch. You can sign up when you go to washdiplomat.com. And one of my latest stories actually is we'll be talking a lot about how the arts organizations are also struggling in this time and trying to go virtual. And I spoke to the woman that is the co-founder of Gala Hispanic Theater, who she came down with coronavirus herself in the middle of a production in March. So as if that doesn't complicate things enough, but fortunately she's doing much better. She's working from home, doing this, learning Zoom, just like all of us. And she talks about the dilemma of it. Does this replace the seeing a live performance in person? It's a dilemma that arts organizations are going to be grappling with. It's a dilemma journalists will be grappling with, and politicians and the world, and my cats and everybody. I think that covers it. But anyway, thank you. Long-winded ending, but thank you everyone so much for joining us. Thank you, Eric, for all
Thanks
of your
for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Insights. We'll be together soon again. And again, for everyone, please stay safe, stay sane in these pretty crazy times, and please stay tuned. We have a lot more information to come. Thank you.